Okay, let's get started. Thanks very much for coming. I'm delighted to introduce Rima Hanna from the Harvard Kennedy School as our speaker today. I just, a couple of words about Rima. You can read all her titles on there. But just to say that she's one of those people who not only uses the most rigorous and creative empirical techniques, but she's always committed to improving the lives of poor people. And she keeps hammering away at that quest with her research. And I remember seeing a quote once about how, we should not think of solutions as the end of the road, but rather when we come up with a solution, always then look at all the possible ramifications of that solution and how to solve the problems that might be created down the road. And I think Rima, both in her own work as well as in this presentation, illustrates that by looking at some of the long-term consequences of some of the short-term solutions that we have introduced. So Rima, welcome.
Oh, sorry, I don't need this one here. I have this one here. Can everyone hear me okay? Great. Okay, thank you so much for having me here today. I'm always very excited when I come to the bank, both because there's so many great people to interact with, and I always feel like I also learn a lot when I'm here. And so I'm particularly excited to be here. So today, I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the work that I've been doing in Indonesia. For many years, I've been working with people both at the World Bank and also in the government of Indonesia, looking at the targeted transfer programs in Indonesia. And so today is a relatively new study that I'd love to share today, looking at the longer run effects of a conditional cash transfer program. And so to do that, what I really would love to do is really start by taking a step back and thinking a little bit about why do we think, many of us, we're always so, in the moment, we're thinking, oh, this kind of social protection program, and we're doing a conditional cash transfer, an unconditional cash transfer program. We're trying to set up a new social insurance, health insurance scheme. But then in the end, it comes back to this, when we're trying to evaluate what we're doing, thinking about, well, why do we think governments have a responsibility to engage in redistribution? And starting off, there's a lot of ethical arguments. Many of us would agree that we think society should take care of the poor. There's arguments about social fabric, that if you want to keep the peace, redistributive programs can help do that. So for example, there's very nice work done looking at the cash transfer program in the Philippines showing effects on crime. There's insurance argument. We're very worried oftentimes that somebody has a bad shock. Suddenly, you lose your job. The family loses their job, and it becomes very difficult for the father to get a new job without, or the mother to get a new job without some additional income source to keep them going in order to help them search for a new job. You're worried about, you have one bad agricultural shock, you have crop loss, and next year you can't afford seeds or fertilizer or supplies. So oftentimes we are worried that there's, as these shocks come through to households, we think about redistribution as also providing an insurance mechanism to ensure that the poor don't get stuck in a poverty trap. There's economic arguments. And one of the big economic arguments is sort of the fiscal policy. A demand for consumer goods could be going down, and we're very worried that this could lead towards recession. And one of the things you want to do is get money into the hands of the poor because they spend it. And they spend it on consumer goods and can help keep the economy afloat. There's a lot of newer arguments as well about the idea of transfers and whether or not they allow the poor, particularly in developing countries where people are cash constrained, might not have access to finance, in order to invest, make business investments that can increase household income and reduce poverty. And then finally, there's a lot of arguments. Sorry. I always start off professional and then I get too constrained. There's a lot of reasons why we think about redistribution as we care about the next generation. We care about intergenerational poverty. We want to make sure families have enough money to send their kids to school, to make early childhood investments in kids with the idea that we settle the playing ground for the the next generation going forward. So why did I go through this list? Well, for me, conditional cash transfer programs are interesting because they are a very particular type of redistributive program. They are going to encapsulate many of the different arguments for redistribution that I've talked about on this list. But more so than anything else is they're longer-term, regular cash transfers to the poor. And they're conditioned on these capital investments in children. And so, the conditions start before birth, where, you have to, see the doctor. It's, oftentimes taking, folic acid, delivery in an institution, continues from vaccination for kids at early ages, into elementary school completion, into junior and secondary school completion. But what's interesting about it is that these two aspects. Of the first is that it's a longer-term transfer payment. It's not something that we're making once when a family is having a bad shock to ensure that they're getting out of poverty, but rather it's the idea that we might be telling a family for the next 6 to 8 years, we're going to be making this regular transfer to you. So it's a longer-term cash payment. The second aspect is the conditions. The idea that we're telling families that this is about investing in the next generation. Now, why is this important? Both aspects together are coming from this theory that we believe that cumulative investments in human capital matter. And that's the thing that could affect intergenerational poverty. That it's not just giving a family some money here and there to send your child to school this week. It's not just about feeding your child today, but rather that you'd have to feed a child well, provide lots of nutritional inputs well for a child from birth over the next 5 or 6 years in order to have these cumulative investments in their health, in order to have impacts into their later outcomes. It's the same with schooling. That it's not necessarily going to be, or just going to incentivize a child to show up to high school, but first you've got to get them to finish elementary school, then junior high, then to high school. And in fact, the development of CCTs, if you go back to it and you go back to the discussions when they were being developed, it was based on this idea of these cumulative investments. And so here's a quote from Santiago Levy, who helped found the Pakeha program in Mexico, one of the first and most famous conditional cash transfer programs. And he said at the time, clearly achieving good health is a cumulative process, and temporary investments in nutrition are of little help. The same is true of education. Children must be supported year after year. Progressive central efforts will gradually occur through the accumulation of human capital. So in some sense, while the conditional cash transfer programs really as we're thinking through the theory of what we want them to achieve when we're thinking about redistribution, as I said, they're hitting many of the different aspects on this list. But this idea of the inequality argument, this idea of the fact that we want to cumulatively invest in the next generation if we want to level the playing field and reduce inequality, was very important in the development of these programs. Okay. Okay. So these conditional cash transfer programs as a concept really started in the 90s. Some of the original Pakeha work that Santiago Levy and others helped create in Mexico. There's also early examples in Brazil and in Bangladesh. And here is just, I'm stealing from the World Bank Safety Net report now, so I'm stealing from you guys, is just the growth of CCTs over time. And so when you look at many low-income and emerging economies around the world, many countries actually have at least one conditional cash transfer program, and they're very much a central tool of the social protection and anti-poverty programs of many governments around the world. Okay, so then the question becomes are CCTs fulfilling the central goal? Are they actually creating, is the cumulative nature of the CCT, the fact that you're making these long-run payments for many, many years, actually having an impact on later life outcomes? And it's very hard to measure just because of the long-run nature of this. Many conditional cash transfer programs, starting with Pakeha, started off with an experimental design. And in fact, that was actually quite nice because it allowed us to understand, are the conditions actually being met? Are the, as you're telling people that, you're going to get this cash payment conditional on sending your children to school, are we actually seeing changes in schooling attainment? As you're conditioning on getting, your children have to be vaccinated, do we see those conditions being met? But the problem is, in most cases, is that the way these experimental designs are run is that they're part of pilot programs, where a government will start with a smaller pilot where they'll do the experimental design. You'll measure outcomes. But then soon afterwards, you're going to extend the program, particularly since they've been shown to be successful at helping families meet these conditions, to the control group. So for example, in the case of Progressa, the Progressa was expanded to the control group about 18 months later. One of the longest studies I've seen so far has been the Philippines, where the control group at least has stayed for at least 2.5 years. So there's very few studies where the control group stays untreated enough in order to be able to measure what is the effect of having this program for many years versus not having the program for many years. Okay. There's this other second question as well with a lot of these evaluations that have been done of the conditional cash transfer programs. As I said, they're usually started as pilots. And when they're started as pilots, they're at a much smaller scale. So the number of people helping to run the program relative to what they would do when the program runs nationally, there's just a lot more people who can really focus on it. And in fact, there's often, if an experimental design is built in, there are often researchers around present as well. So if I could tell you on, some of the projects I work on, where if I'm involved, I spend every day on the phone with the government, talking about details, giving advice, checking, was this done? Really making sure, because I want the thing to have the best chance of success. But then the evaluation could be telling us what happens when there's much more focus and attention on it, but not necessarily what happens when suddenly it's scaled up to many more people around the country, the researcher is no longer involved, the government they're trying to run this program in many different areas, and they're not going to be able to devote the staff or the time in the same way to making sure it runs. There's other reasons as well that these programs might decline over time or change over time. So for example, with a lot of conditional cash transfer programs, including the one in Indonesia, some areas conditions are enforced, some areas conditions are not enforced. Maybe people learn over time that they can still get access to the transfer even if they don't change their behavior. It also could be that a program comes in the first year, families are really excited, something new is happening, and then over time it just becomes commonplace and it no longer affects your decision making. And then finally, there's another reason why these programs could just decline over time. Countries are growing. In fact, as we'll show, Indonesia, in the project I'm going to be talking about, Indonesia over time, per capita consumption has been growing steadily over time. At the same time, during the time of the evaluation, the nominal level of the benefits hadn't changed. It changed somewhat after this final survey was done. And so you can imagine the amount of the payment relative to people's consumption and income level is now reducing over time, and this might really affect their decision making as well. Maybe the incentives have less bite. Okay. So what are we going to do? This was really a very unique opportunity, I think, to try to get at some of these questions that I was talking about, both about the cumulative nature of cash transfer programs and also just what happens when they've been running for a very long time. Even on these static, do people actually stay meeting the incentives? And so what we're doing is I'm going to be talking about this policy experiment that was testing the impact of Indonesia's conditional cash transfer program called Pakeha. When the government of Indonesia decided to set up this program, they were working very closely with the World Bank office in Jakarta. And they decided to set it up as a randomized design. And I'll talk more about the details as we get into it. And so and then there was a survey done about 2 years later to evaluate the effects of the program, and that was the plan. After that, there were some very good results in that survey showing Pakeha had done, was helping changing people's behavior regarding both health and education. And as a result, Pakeha was expanded. And so by 2013, which is when the survey that I'm going to be talking about, which so about 6 years later, was occurring, about 3,400 of the sub-districts of Indonesia were covered across 330 districts. It was spread out across all of Indonesia's provinces and covering 2.3 million households. So it was a very, very large-scale program spread about many, many islands all over the country. But it was still not reaching all of the sub-districts. It was still not reaching all of the districts in Indonesia. And for much of that is also for financial reasons. And so when the government of Indonesia was choosing where to expand, they had to make decisions. And so one decision could have been, well, we started in these districts and these provinces where we had started the pilot. Let's just intensely do everything there. And they decided not to do that, but rather they said, which is often done for many reasons, why don't we spread out Pakeha across the country? As a result, when they were doing the process of spreading out, many of the initial control sub-districts in the experiment were never treated 6 years later. And in fact, actually, I'll show more information later on, but 60% of the control group was not treated 6 years later. So this created a really unique opportunity to be able to study these two types of questions as we've been talking about. The first is whether or not these static effects of Pakeha on the targeted indicators persisted over time. So again, this is our parents sending their children to elementary school, sending their children to junior high school. Are they delivering in an institution when they have a baby? Is it still the effects we saw at the 2-year mark? Are they still happening at the 6-year mark after the researchers have gone home and after the program has become this giant national program, which as anyone who's run any sort of giant behemoth of a program knows, it always comes with challenges. The second thing that we're able to do is say, well, what happened not only to these targeted indicators, are kids going to school more, but how is it affecting longer-term human capital investments? So if you take a child who their mother was pregnant at the time Pakeha started, they've been on the program on Pakeha from when their mother was pregnant up until age 5. How does that affect, for example, things such as stunting? If you take a child who, when they started Pakeha, they were in elementary school, and Pakeha at that point might have helped them stay in elementary school and go on to junior high school, do we see them being at a higher rate of going on to high school? And so trying to understand whether or not these cumulative effects of Pakeha in terms of helping kids are actually leading to what was the initial ideas of having these longer run cash transfer programs. Yeah. Okay. Where am I on time? Sorry. Just to. Okay. Okay, because I have many, many more slides. Okay. So what I'd like to do today is talk a little bit about the setting, a little bit about the experimental design and the data that was collected for this. And then I want to do something very specific where I first look at what happens on the incentivized health behaviors. And that is really, those are the targeted indicators in some sense, or in actuality. And then looking at actual health outcomes. And so, for example, wasting and stunting. Then I want to look at the incentivized targets for education. Are they still having impacts, as we've seen on the new kids who have come in, the way we had 4 years earlier? And then to look at some non-incentivized outcomes, such as child labor. And then finally, I'm going to track the high school education labor and early marriage of the children who were enrolled in Pakeha when the program began. Now, note, I think of this as a bit more of like a medium run than a long run study, because when we start to look at the children who graduating high school and whether or not they're working after high school and teenage marriage, those are the children who were enrolled in Pakeha when they were originally around 12 or 13 years old, and so they're not getting the really early childhood intervention. So it'll be the cumulative effects for them based on where they started when Pakeha started as a program. So I'll talk more as we get into that. And then finally, I want to look at household economic arguments. There's some arguments. Actually, Pearl Gertler has some very nice work in Mexico where also showing this idea that in Progressa, one of the aspects of these cumulative cash transfer programs is people can save more and then invest in productive assets. And so they start to see that in the Progressa program. So the other thing we start to look at, if there are cumulative impacts on the household in terms of creating these bigger jumps out of poverty and economic outcomes, to try to understand and get at this question of, when we think of these cash transfer programs that are providing small amount of regular support to families over time, is it really doing transformational effects on poverty today, or is it really about how we're trying to impact sort of intergenerational poverty in the future? And so I want to think a little bit more about that when we get to the conclusion. And after seeing the results, I'd also love to get some feedback and thoughts on that as well. OK. Oh, OK. So I'm just going to grab. Sorry. OK, so Pakeha, or the Hopeful Family Program, launched in 2007. It provides quarterly cash transfers to the poor with a fraction of the payment conditional on health and educational related obligations. The original aim of the program was to reduce current poverty and to improve the quality of human resources among poor households. And so this gets back into this, the debate, as I was just talking about, this idea of whether or not Pakeha is having transformational effects on current poverty now versus whether or not it's really aiming to get at these intergenerational poverty impacts. Okay. It's a targeted cash transfer program. So, and it's targeted to the extremely, extremely poor households. So it's about the bottom 7%. The targeting is done through a proxy means test. It's sort of a combination of a proxy means test and a community-based targeting, where facilitators go to villages to try to figure out who from the village they should survey. So they usually survey about 60% of the population. And then they do a standard proxy means test, which I know many of you at the bank have worked on, where you collect demographic variables and asset variables and predict out who should be below the poverty line. It also has this additional demographic requirement that a lot of conditional cash transfer programs look like. Households with a pregnant woman are included. Households with children, age 0 to 15 years old are included, mostly because of this idea of the conditions. That the idea is that this is a program geared at improving health and education for kids. It looks, to be honest, it looks very standard in terms of you're comparing it to cash transfer programs around the world, mostly because a lot of these programs were initially, they're modeled after Progressa. At the time, many people even, visited Latin America from Asia to see the programs, and they were similarly set up in many parts of the world. Okay. So, eligible households, what did they receive? So as I said, they received quarterly cash payments. They're designed to be 15 to 20% of annual income. In reality, when you look at our survey data, it's closer to 7 to 14%. The payments are made through the Postal Service. There's been actually a lot of nice work done by the Jakarta office of the World Bank tracing the payments. And in fact, actually, the Postal Service does a very nice job and there's relatively little corruption, and payments actually seem to get into the hands of the beneficiaries. The transfers are based on conditions. And again, this is very similar to a lot of CCT programs you see all over the world. It's about children being in school, enrolled in school. It's about attendance of the children. It's about vaccinations, a delivery in an institution. So it's a standard list. I think I sent along the paper, so the full list is in the paper for those who are interested. Trained facilitators. So there's trained Pakeha facilitators in the areas, and they're supposed to they were supposed to do some outreach to the community, and they're also supposed to do the verification. The verification didn't begin till at least 2010, so about 2-3 years later. Even then, there are areas where the conditions are better enforced, and there are areas where the conditions are really not enforced. And I think that's actually a high part of the. I think they're largely not always enforced. Okay. So initially, the government of Indonesia tested Pakeha, and they tested it. It was a really large-scale study because it was tested across 6 different provinces. And the reason for this is that, who has been to Indonesia? Yeah? Okay, a fair amount. It's a very diverse country with lots of, every province is different food to try. So part of why, when they were initially setting up the evaluation, they wanted it fairly spread out because they wanted to understand if it turns into a national program, they wanted to make sure the program could work in different areas. And so what they did is they chose the districts in those provinces. They dropped districts that were very rich. They also dropped districts that were not supply side ready. So with the idea being that if the area it doesn't have the right, it doesn't have hospitals and schools that can accommodate the kids, the conditional cash transfer program wasn't going to work. And so I was not involved in the decision-making process at that time, but this is what was done. They randomized the remaining 736 sub-districts. 438 were assigned to the treatment group. Out of these, 360 were chosen to be in the study. As you can see, half are in the control, half, oops, oh, this does not work. Oh, okay. Well, I was told not to move. Okay, half are in the control, half are in the treatment, and they're sort of, they're spread across the different areas of Indonesia. Okay. Okay. So the idea was that they did the randomization, but there's 2 questions to ask. Is first of all, was a treatment group actually treated? And the answer, as you can see in the third column over here, about 99% of the treatment group was treated. So they did a nice job in treating the treatment group. But there's also, always going to be, reasons why the control group gets treated, regardless of, politics or administration or all sorts of things in the background. And so during the 2-year follow-up, about 80% of the control was not treated, 20% was treated. By the 6th year, as I talked about, just for the reasons why they decided to spread it mostly nationally, you've got 60% of the control group untreated, 40% treated. Okay. So the World Bank team led by Vivi Alatas and others conducted both the baseline survey and a 2-year follow-up. There were about 14,000 households surveyed at baseline. That's about 75,000 individuals. So it was a very, very intensive, very large-scale evaluation. Households were randomly selected to be surveyed from the targeting list, not the beneficiary list. So not everybody in the sample will receive Pakeha. So what do I mean by that? Is that you do the targeting. You have PMT scores for everybody. But as I said, there's a bit of this community choosing and verification in the treatment areas that's not happening in the control areas. So you don't fully know in the control areas who's going to be a beneficiary. So instead, they surveyed from the targeting list, which is mostly, it's mostly from the bottom of the distribution, but it's not perfect. And that's just important for some of the methodology I'm going to talk about in a bit. It was really interesting at the time, too. They conducted, the whole evaluation was actually done with, there was another evaluation of another program happening at the same time called Generasi, which is these community block grants, sometimes incentivized, some not incentivized. So it's sort of like a community CCT. And so not only did they randomize it to understand the impact of Pakeha versus control, they randomized it to understand the impact of Pakeha versus the conditional cash transfer against the community cash transfer. So all of the surveys were the same, and a lot of the methodologies are also similar to that program. Okay. So the government of Indonesia actually decided to look at, it's a team within the government of Indonesia, the co-authors who I work with, who recognize the fact that at 2013, about 6 years later, that so many of the control areas weren't treated. And so why don't we start to run a survey and try to understand some of these longer run outcomes. And so we have been working with them. And it's interesting. So we found about 95% of the original 14,000 households in the baseline survey and interviewed them. So, which is pretty impressive for trying to find people. I don't know, I'm assuming many people here have worked on surveys, how difficult it is to trace people over time. So it's a pretty high find rate for this 6 year. And what part of that was that if somebody moved within the sub-district, they tracked them down and interviewed them as well. Now, there's another issue that, that while attrition was very low for households, sometimes some household members would leave. So for example, I'm still living in my same house, but I have a 5-year-old. My 5-year-old is now 11 years old. The 11-year-old is probably living with me. But if I had a 15-year-old at the time Pakeha started, that 21-year-old might have left to go for work or marriage. So again, when target individuals left the household, they tried, the survey company tried to trace them within the sub-district. There's still higher rates of attrition as the older the kids get. But if not, what was asked is, even if the children had left, why did they leave? So did they leave for marriage? Did they leave for work? Did they leave for schooling? And what we find is that even when there was attrition for those older kids, it was relatively balanced against treatment and control, and there didn't appear to be differential attrition. So overall, we think that this 6-year follow-up is doing a decent job in terms of tracking the kids, or at least the best we could hope for. Okay. So the data collection was done. The survey was done to collect information on the families and the children 6 years later. What did we do? So what we did is we looked at the impact of receiving Pakeha on the household outcomes. And so I'm going to be showing you lots of figures that are all following this methodology, where I'm looking at the impact of receiving Pakeha on an outcome. And what I'm doing is, because whether or not you received Pakeha is not random, because some people in our sample didn't receive Pakeha because they didn't pass the targeting, or some of the control villages were actually treated, I'm using the original treatment status as an instrument for whether or not you receive Pakeha. And then I do all sorts of things. I include strata fixed effects and control variables and do all sorts of methodology. These are less interesting. They're like very sort of standard. It's all in the paper. I'm also happy to discuss details with anyone if you want to discuss afterwards. But this is the basic estimation strategy I'm using for the rest of the findings. Okay. So the first thing I want to talk about is starting off with health, and then we'll move on to education, some of the longer run outcomes around work, and then economic outcomes. And so first, I'm going to talk about the incentivized health behaviors, and then within there, I'm going to talk about the incentivized health behaviors, and then the health outcomes. So the incentivized health behaviors are mostly looking at the targets. Do you still see effects on the targets 6 years later, like you did on 2 for the newer people who have come in? Starting off with the most, you start off Pakeha starting off before the children are born, with prenatal visits, and then also with whether the type of delivery you have. And so this is whether or not you had good assisted delivery and delivery at a health institution. A lot of my figures are going to look similar. I mix it up somewhat. But basically, the first panel graphs the 2-year effects. The second panel graphs the 6-year effects. The dot is the treatment effect, and then I have the confidence interval to get a sense of if it's significant or not. So this first one is looking at delivery. And so you see in the 2-year follow-up, there was effects on good assisted delivery and delivery in a health institution. 6 years later, for women who are now again, getting pregnant and having children, Pakeha is still having a large effect on delivery behaviors. And in fact, Pakeha led to a 17 percentage point increase in delivery in a health facility in the 6-year follow-up. So it's still having an effect on that targeted indicator. Interestingly, though, there was, at the 2-year mark, prenatal and postnatal visits, there was a treatment effect of Pakeha increasing the number of visits women were having. But by 6 year, the point estimate is much, much smaller. And as you can tell from the confidence interval hitting the 0 mark in such a strong fashion, that it's no longer significant. Now here is where looking at what happened to the control group over time is interesting, because what you're seeing is Indonesia is getting richer at this time, health systems are improving, and the control group is catching up to the treatment group in terms of visits. So what you see is that before it might have been that the treatment group moved up like this, and here is the control, and now the control group is moved up to the same level. So you're still at the level of the treatment effect, it's just that maybe it's having less of an effect because you've reached the max visits, and in fact you're actually getting out close to 7 visits instead, so the right number of visits, because the control group is just catching up. Okay, and then immunizations. So here, again, the immunizations, I find them hard to classify, because on one hand, you have them as soon as the baby is born, you have the first immunizations, but then on the other hand, there's sort of a cumulative aspect of them as well, that you're more likely to have the follow-up shots if you've had the first initial shots. So I feel like they're somewhere in the middle. At the 2-year mark, there was a positive, the point estimate was positive, that it was having an effect on percent of immunizations per age, but it was not significant. By 6 year, it's actually, it increases a bit, but basically it's becoming much more significant and much more common. And so what you're finding is about a 5 percentage point increase at the 6-year mark in terms of increasing vaccinations. And then finally, the last targeted indicator we're looking at is times weighed. The child was weighed, which was another one of the targeted indicators, is that children needed to be weighed a certain amount of times for parents to continue to receive their payments. And here again, it's interesting. At the 2-year mark, times weighed was positive and significant. It goes away at the 6-year mark. Again, this is in part due to the control group catching up, and it's probably coming from the fact that the postnatal visits are increasing in the control group, and everybody is just now getting weighed. Okay, so what does that tell us? So it's telling us that on some of the targeted indicators for health, Pakeha is no longer having an effect. But it's not that, but that in part it could be because of the control group just catching up naturally. On other indicators where the control group hasn't necessarily caught up, Pakeha is still having an impact on health indicators. The question is whether or not the fact that Pakeha has been having impact on the health indicators over time isn't actually translating to gains for children, which is what we, in the end, that's why we're all here. That's what we ultimately care about. And so we're going to look at effects on 2 aspects of measured child health. Malnourishment, which is low weight for age. We're going to look at more than 2 standard deviations below WH standards. This is something that we think about as responding more quickly to health investments. You suddenly feed a child more over the last month, maybe their weight gets a little higher. There's a shock to the family. There's not enough money for food this month, their weight goes down. It's something that might fluctuate more with given conditions. The second measure we're looking at is stunting, which we think of as more of a cumulative measure of health investments over the first, we're looking at age 0 to 60 over the first years of life. Again, we're looking at more than 2 standard deviations below the WH standards, and also 3 standard deviations for severe stunting. And partly because this gives us a sense of the cumulative health investments, and because we also think it's important, because we do think height at younger ages is correlated with cognitive and better cognitive and economic outcomes later in life. Okay. So the first thing we have is, here's malnourished, so that's 2 standard deviations below, severely malnourished, 3 standard deviations below, and we don't see any effect on malnourishment. So we're not seeing any effect on the weight for age. It's interesting. If you break it down by gender, you do see an effect on malnourishment for boys. You don't see an effect for girls. Okay. Stunting. At the 2-year mark, if you're looking at the children aged 0 to 5, you don't see an effect on stunting. Now, at that point, children had been in Pakeha for at most 2 years, or a combination of some of their time that their mother was pregnant and their life. By the 6-year mark, if you look at children aged 0 to 5, the children have, the kids who are 5 years old, the Pakeha would have started when their mothers were pregnant. So everyone in our sample of 0 to 5 has been in Pakeha getting these early childhood investments in health over the course of their full life. And here, by the 6th year, we actually see a pretty big decline in stunting. And in fact, this is 9 to 11 percentage point decline in stunting, which is about a quarter reduction in the probability of being stunting. So it's a pretty big effect. What's interesting is if you break it down for both boys and girls, it's there for both boys and girls, but qualitatively it's much bigger for boys, which might be connected to the fact that we saw only the malnourishment results for boys. And so it might be that even when Pakeha comes in, giving additional health investments and food for the family, that some of these investments are going to boys. It's hard to fully trace out, but it is there in the data. Okay, so it's there across all the different ages from the kids, the 1 to 2-year-olds, up into age 4 to 5 that you see these effects on stunting. So it's pretty consistently there. It is interesting for me. So when I took a step back and I'm like, these are really amazing results on stunting, the academic in me says, well, what's driving it? And it's hard because Pakeha is a bundled intervention. There's lots of things going on. There are the cash payments, there's the conditions, there's the incentives, there's facilitators giving information. There, as a result of this, is it the family spending their money differently on food, or is it about the doctor visits? And it's hard to know what it is. But in the we tried to look at what we could in the data to try to understand what might be different factors contributing to the decline in stunting. If you ask about whether or not the child has had diarrhea or colds in the last week, we don't really see much there. It's interesting. If you ask about breastfeeding, whether or not you can imagine that as a result of Pakeha, women go to the doctor more, they're told more about breastfeeding, and the breastfeeding could lead to reductions in stunting. But actually, breastfeeding is pretty high in Indonesia. I mean, it's not perfect, and we don't see changes there. We also don't see changes in investments in sanitation, or just in general on mothers' knowledge of good behaviors. Where we do see some changes which start to speak to mechanisms, you see the improved delivery and immunization, so maybe there's something about connections to the health sector. If you actually ask the parents about their children's birth weight, they're much more likely to know the weight of their children. And it might be that there's just a salience about weight that's coming from the program, and that is causing the parents to act differently. We also see changes in nutritional intake of kids. So at the 2-year mark, you don't see changes in eating rice. Everybody eats lots of rice. You don't see changes in other grains that are also there. You don't see much changes in meat, but meat's also expensive. What you do see changes are in eggs and milk, that they're feeding the children more eggs and milk at the 2-year mark, and so that might be contributing. The 6-year mark, it's not significant, but due to the sampling, we lose half of our sample, so it's hard to rule out it's different, but there is some sort of indication that maybe it's coming from this change in eggs and milk consumption for the kids. Okay. Okay, so next is how am I? Oh my God, okay. Oh, I thought I would get through in 20 minutes, and somehow I've taken up much longer than I have so many slides left. Okay, so let me then go through some of the results somewhat quickly. I won't describe the graphs as much because they're pretty similar. but head to the headlines. There is little effect. If you look at schooling for kids aged 7 to 12, there's less of an effect. You still see and a little bit of an effect of enrollment in school, but 97% of the kids in this age are already enrolled in school. Indonesia has relatively high primary school enrollment. The effects that are there are basically getting rid of that final truancy, but it's relatively small because most of the kids are in school. It's at older ages that kids tend to drop out. So then the next targeted group is 13 to 15-year-olds. You saw effects at the 2-year mark, and those effects continue to stay at the 6-year mark. So there's a 12 percentage point increase in school enrollment at 2 years, a 9 percentage point at 6 years. This is a 56 and 52% reduction in non-enrollment, respectively. So pretty big enrollments in sort of this middle school enrollment. Interestingly, if you break it down by gender, the effects are larger for boys and girls. Pakeha seems to be doing better for boys. But this is coming from the fact that boys are a lot less likely to be enrolled in school than girls. And so it could just be that it gets the boys up to the same level as the girls. OK. Child labor. So is it that child labor, kids are more likely to be in school, child labor is, as a result, going down? If you look at the 7 to 12-year-olds, you don't see an effect in either the 2 or the 6-year. But honestly, as you can see from here, there's basically very few kids working in this age group that you wouldn't expect. I would be doing something wrong if you got these giant effects, because the kids are not working in this age group. But there are more kids working age 13 to 15. And there, actually, what you see in both the 2-year and the 6-year mark, Pakeha is leading to reductions in child labor for kids aged 13 to 15. Again, it's interesting. This is primarily for boys, where we're seeing a lot of these effects. But if you also look at the data, the boys are more likely to be out of school and working than the girls. And so when you see effects on both the increases in enrollment and decreases in child labor, you're going to expect to see it for the boys, because they're more likely to, you would theoretically expect for them to be affected by the program. We also looked, though, for the girls are more engaged than the boys in housework. We don't see effects on the time spent engaging in housework for girls at this age group. OK, so with punchline, with Pakeha, older kids, particularly boys, are more likely to stay enrolled in school longer, less likely to be working, less of an effect on the young who are already in school. And so things were already quite good to begin with. OK. High school, education, labor, and early marriage. So once you get to the older kids, the 15 to 16-year-olds, the conditions are phasing out. And so then the question is, what happens to the children as they, as they're phasing out of the Pakeha conditions and into, into their lives? And so the first thing we're going to do is look at schooling, then we're going to look at labor market, and then looking at early marriage and fertility. OK. So at the 2-year mark, there's no significant effect on staying longer in school for longer. But at that point, at 2 years, if you had already, you wouldn't expect, you could expect some impact because the family is getting additional money and maybe there's more focus on school. But if you had already dropped out of middle school, there's little chance you're going to suddenly come back into school. And so you don't see as much of an effect. It's positive, but not significant in the 2-year. But by the 6-year mark, you're starting off with kids who, they're 15 to 21-year-old now. They started off 6 years earlier. They were about 11 when Pakeha started. They would have gotten the benefits of Pakeha in terms of the, staying enrolled, more likely to stay enrolled in middle school and that secondary school. And what you're seeing is then they're much more likely to stay enrolled in school when they hit age 15 to 17. Some of this is coming from being more likely to go to high school. Some of this is they're still in middle school, especially around the 15-year-old mark. But they're, as Pakeha stayed in for longer, they're more likely to stay enrolled. And it is a pretty big effect. Again, I guess this is mostly it's a story about the boys. The effect is really driven by the boys who dropped out of high school at a higher rate than the girls. Okay, so in the data we had, we didn't have kids 18 to 21 originally at the 2-year mark because they wouldn't have been enrolled, they wouldn't have been enrolled in Pakeha at that point. But we do at the 6-year mark, and we start to see the effects of the CCT program on high school completion for those 18 to 21. As I said, those would have been age 12 to 15 when Pakeha started. And this is entirely driven by the boys. Okay. So then what happens to work? So there's 2 aspects of work here still. We've got the 15 to 17-year-olds who you'd still want them to be in school. And then there's the 18 to 21-year-olds who you think might be entering the workforce. So the 16 to 17-year-olds, are they less likely to work due to the fact that we're seeing effects on schooling? We don't see this to be the case in terms of working for a wage. If you look at other aspects of what the kids are doing with their time, you do see both boys and girls less likely to work in the family business. So it's possible that in going to school longer, they're less likely to work for the family business at that stage. And here you see girls less likely to be helping out with the housework as well. So there might be some substitution with in-house production in terms of going to school, not necessarily with the formal labor market. Okay, the 18 to 21-year-olds. So we don't see an effect on wage work at this point. So the question is, well, they're more likely to completed a little bit more of school. Would there be an effect on work? And we don't see that to be the case. If we look at where the kids are spending their time, for the boys, they're more likely to be working in the family business. So it's possible that they did a little bit more school, and then the work they've gone to is working out with the family business, although then the girls are less likely to be doing anything in general. It's hard to say, because this is at a point where these are the children who are already older when Pakeha started. So they were 12 to 15-year-olds when Pakeha started. So they might have gotten some aspects of benefits of Pakeha in that there was additional income for their family, so there could have been an income effect. And they would have maybe benefited from being more likely to stay in middle school and going on further in high school. But they weren't getting the early childhood investments. And so what I think would be interesting is, I'm not going to tell the government of Indonesia not to treat the control, but if it's still in place a couple years later, it'd be worth following up on the kids who started Pakeha at an even earlier stage, whether or not that led to changes in work, and what also happened for this cohort as well. Okay, and then finally, we looked at marriage, teenage marriage. We don't see an effect on child marriage. One of the things, child marriage in Indonesia tends to be in pockets, so we also looked geographically in the poorest regions where we thought child marriage was more likely and where there would be effects. And you see it's having a little bit more of an effect in those regions, but not strong enough that I feel confident in any of that. We also looked at fertility, and there again, it was very interesting. You start to see some patterns in the data that the younger kids who are enrolled in Pakeha are a little less likely to have kids at age 16 to 17, but more likely at 18 to 21. So there could be some shifting over time, but again, I personally don't feel super confident in that, just because of the noisiness of the data, and you're in smaller events at that point. Okay. So in short, the kids are staying in school longer. It's not translating yet to increased wage employment, but again, we see boys working more in the family business, so it might be that that's where they're going to if they stay in school longer. And then it's also this issue of it's getting at the Pakeha program for the older kids, but not necessarily what's happening to the younger kids and how that accumulates. Okay, and then finally, because I know I have 2 minutes left, we wanted to look at whether or not it's having huge impacts on poverty. So Pakeha provides a small amount of cash for about 6 years. The payment was about 7 to 15% of total household consumption. It cumulatively adds up to $360 to $1,300 per household. The question is, are households saving it? Are they investing in productive assets? There is some work from Progressa that starting to see some accumulation and productive assets. That's the only paper I've seen, but it'd be nice if people have suggestions for other work in this area. I'd be very interested. In this case, you see an effect. The consumption effect it's not even significant. Consumption is very noisy, and this is not a huge amount of money relative to overall consumption, and so it's very noisy to pick up. So the point estimate is positive, but there's just a huge amount of noise around it. The areas where you pick up effects on consumption are the poorest regions within the sample, and that's where you see the largest effects on consumption. You don't see any impacts on the number of livestock owned. So it's not that the transfer of payments are being used to make investments in, at least in livestock, as a productive asset. Here's the household head employment. You see no effects, but honestly, again, this is where the descriptive evidence matters a lot. 95% of the people are working anyway. So it's not that you would expect to see, there's even scope to move that much further. Okay. So now I know in like an hour I've gone through lots and lots of results. For me, trying to think about how to put it together, and I'd love more comments to think about what this means, and also if there are other programs that are starting to see similar effects and how this fits in. For me, it's Pakeha is it's a continual payment. As I said, it's about 7% of consumption. It's a small payment made to households regularly for many years. We don't see huge effects on asset accumulation or employment. It does seem to promote even though the program has scaled up considerably. Researchers are no longer involved, and it's been running for many years now. It's still having effects on the targeted indicators, such as increases in births and school enrollment. So it still seems to be moving along those household investments we care about. And it's starting to have some impacts on these cumulative outcomes that I think were the original goal of what these CCT programs were supposed to hit. So for example, we do see the large reductions in stunting coming over time as the kids age, and some evidence of this increased high school completion. Again, we don't see yet this translating to employment for those who have started to age out of Pakeha. For me, it's interesting. I'm still thinking a lot about it and what it means, because again, these are individuals who were teenagers when Pakeha started. So they spent fewer years in the program, and they didn't benefit from the early childhood investment. And if we think the early childhood investments that are leading to the stunting results, and that is having an effect on future life outcomes, is what we think the core of what the cash transfer program is going to do, I think it's very important to do even longer run research tracing those kids to see what happens over time. But I'll stop now just because I see Chantal looking at me like she won't stop talking. Thank you.
No, thanks very much, Rima. That was great. So let's open up for questions. We'll take about 2 or 3, and you can.
Okay.
You can.
Although I wish can I borrow a
Yep.
paper?
You want-
Thank you.
Adam.
So I had a couple of thoughts, Rima. One is that time is sort of doing 2 things as we move from 2 years to 6 years. One is that the program is getting bigger, and a lot of the points you were making earlier about going to scale and you not calling the government every minute to see what's going on. The other is kids have a chance to be exposed for longer, right? So when I was looking at your stunting results, I couldn't help but think, it'd be nice to tease those 2 things apart. So, presumably the program effects are not going to 0 from year 3 onwards, otherwise you probably wouldn't see the change you're seeing, but it's your results are consistent with them dropping away. It struck me you could actually control for exposure and do a nice little table where you have exposure time and the age, the sort of the maturity of the program along the other axis. The other point I was thinking is going back to your points about everybody going to Progressor, copying and pasting, and Progressor started I think in 1997. So I think some of your slides, particularly on health, were kind of a bit of a warning about copying and pasting from a program that was suitable for Mexico at the time, but probably isn't very suitable for a lot of middle-income countries nowadays. Simply because, as you say, with economic growth, we're getting up to the point where there's not much scope to move on a lot of these indicators. So there's another nice paper by Paul Gertlow on the supply side incentives for Argentina, where he doesn't look at the effects on, for example, antenatal care, because that's 100%. But what he does look at is the effects on the timing of the first visit, whether it was in the first trimester. So I'm thinking that for the CCT aficionados, there's a kind of a next generation of indicators to look at, and that some of the supply side work on health may give some ideas as to what those indicators might be.
Yeah, I said we were going to take 3 questions, but there were already 3, I think, and Adam's. All right, I'll take one more, and then, yeah, in the back. Can you come to the mic, please?
So I was just going to ask, is that on?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just going to ask one question. So you looked at enrollment, but I was wondering, and you looked at labor market, I was wondering if you looked at the number of years of education, or like in terms of education attainment of children over the 6-year time frame.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, so, I also have this. I don't know, should I take?
Yeah.
So I don't cause like massive static between the two. Can everyone hear me? Oh, great. So on the first one, on the effects of exposure time, that's a great suggestion. I'm going to steal it. I think actually I think this is where, for me, I do think the cumulative impacts are having an effect on stunting, and the fact that you start to see it in the 2-year and it's coming to the 6, but maybe an exposure diagram could help tease that out a bit more. And in fact, part of why we were trying to look at, these are targeted outcomes for the new kids versus trying to think about which indicators we think are cumulative for kids over time as they're going through, is to try to tease this out a bit more, because there are these 2 factors inherent in the program and it's hard to fully separate out. So I think you're right. There is where I think it's most interesting to think about, especially as you start thinking about not just the impacts of the program, but how it's going to move forward. I agree with you completely on the second about the copying and the pasting, and that also with economic growth, a lot of the indicators might not be necessary. I do think in the original Progressive one, I thought this was the case as well, that some of the indicators weren't necessary because they were very high, but it was a political issue as well. It sounds nicer to the electorate if you're meeting certain indicators, and so I know that with these kind of programs, there might be conflicting needs. It would be interesting to think about what kind of indicators you would want going forward and using some of the data to do more of that. So I completely agree, and I'd love to see I haven't seen the Argentina study yet, but it's gonna look for that on my list to read. On the enrollments and labor market, I think right now we've broken it up by age categories to completion. We do have the data to look at completed, like just the overall years. I just haven't done that yet, and that's something I can do. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks for a wonderful presentation. A couple of questions. One similar to what Adam asked. First, you talk about malnourishment and you talk about stunting. Stunting is actually a form of malnourishment, and the whether it's underweight or stunting, underweight is more current, stunting being more chronic. So I think it's useful to put that in perspective. But you see impacts on stunting, which is great, at a 6-year point, which makes sense from a physiological point of view as well, in addition to exposure time of the program. What I didn't hear from you is about whether there was a difference in supply side versus the demand side interventions across, and whether you analyze by that thing, in the sense that there may have been districts that were more ready on the supply side and districts that were less ready on the supply side, and whether we could see results from those. The idea being, you know, as we advise governments, and we're talking actually right now to government of Indonesia and designing a large-scale program, where should they put their monies vis-a-vis this thing? And a couple of other things, if I may. The story on the boys, this was also the story coming out of Guatemala many years ago. It was the boys that showed over time increases in wages, not the girls. And I wonder we never were able to answer that question, and I'm wondering if you can dig a little bit deeper into that. And then, of course, longer term, you seem to be suggesting that these CCTs should be long-term programs. What are the fiscal implications of those versus governments which are asking for quote-unquote exit strategies out of these programs? So, thank you. Sorry.
Enough supply side for the CCT to matter. I could probably get more, you know, there are these community surveys that were done as well where they have more of, where they collected data about the supply side. So we probably could look at some of the interactions on the supply side and probably could do that. For the boys, for the Guatemala, I think that's also very interesting. Here, I think some of it's coming from the fact that the boys are just lower on a lot of these indicators to begin with, and there's more scope for improvement, at least for the education and health. It'd be interesting to see the changes in work, especially if we do, depending on what happens in the field, and if we ever do another survey to see what happens with their work outcomes. For the exit strategy, to be honest, I think that's the right question to ask. And in fact, actually, my newer research that I've been like consumed by for the last few years is trying to design something to get at this, to try to think more about what happens not just when people get on the CCT, but off the CCT. How do you find the right people to target to remove them off the CCT? Can you use methods of self-selection to do that? And so that's what, to be honest, I think I agree with you completely. That's the big policy question for a lot of these countries that started these programs, 6 to 8 to 10 years ago. That's sort of the next set of policy questions, and that's also something I think is super important.
Hi. Thanks. Fabulous presentation. It's, I think I could speak for the whole SPJ family to say it's really important to have more understanding of some of the long-term impacts. I'm on the advisory group for the Prospera long-term evaluation, and trying to tell 20 years later what, when you've only got an 18-month difference, it's really complicated. So it's lovely to have some good work in a place where you can have a longer time horizon. A couple of comments on either future work or how to think about the interpretation of some of it. I think one of the sort of most worrisome questions we have in this whole field is on the stunting. So, like, why can we not be having bigger impacts on stunting? And so I always like to be really clear to look at the cohort of kids on which you might expect to have an impact. So you said your 2-year impact on 0 to 5-year-olds wasn't very big, but what are you doing with 4 to 5-year-olds in that cohort to start with? I mean, that was kind of the wrong place to look for an impact. So I would be a little careful on your theory of change and on then making your selection match and describe all of that. And I think it's also important to think about sort of the tensions in the design. So your interpretations and the indicators you put up are all about the human capital side, but all of the programs are a mix of the poverty reduction and the human capital side. So in a lot of countries, you can't get much change in primary enrollment because it's already quite high, and yet you keep the kids in the program during that time, or the households in the program during that time, because essentially for the poverty side of things, and because it's a mess to have people coming in and out of the program every year depending on the demographics of their family. So some thought about that, and maybe some looking at heterogeneity by poverty level to the degree that you can would be very useful. All the stuff you can give us on heterogeneity of impacts is incredibly welcome. And that would also say, thinking about, being more clear than you could in this presentation, which kids' compliance and what that does to the payment. Because in Mexico, for example, a family can stay in Prospera and an individual youth can drop out because they're not going to school densely enough. So whether that youth counts as in or treated, untreated, semi-treated, clarity on that kind of question I think is really important, because the program designs actually vary from country to country as to whether the penalties are individual specific or family as a group. So just being clear on that I think is helpful.
I also have 6 questions, but maybe we get one more and then I can answer these as well. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I'm just curious to know, and you know you showed a lot of outcomes in terms of primary school and onwards. Do you have any information on preschool enrollments for the younger kids? Because this is a period where the government is doing a lot on expanding access to preschool. And I'm wondering to what extent some of the channels are that additional accumulation of education.
Okay.
Yeah, so I'm having trouble interpreting the magnitude of some of the results. Is there any way you can benchmark them to say like a 7 to 15% increase on the income distribution?
Good comments. Okay, so the first one, so I agree with you on the 0 to 5. So the reason why we put 0 to 5 at the 2-year is that they're still at a 5-year-old would have started at 3. But I agree with you, and so we've also looked at just the 0 to 2, and we don't see that. You start to see it, but not much there. So I really do think that's more evidence on the cumulative, but I think you're right that maybe that's what we need to get at earlier questions of maybe we need to look, be a little bit more careful about how we do that. On the human capital side and poverty reduction, I completely agree, and I would love to pick your brain more about that. On the heterogeneity by poverty level, I think that's something we want to do more of. We've looked a little bit. You do see, for example, bigger effects on consumption in the poorer areas and things like that. We try to look a little bit on some of the marriage and fertility questions in the poorest areas, because that's where it's the biggest problem. We still don't see much of an effect there, but I think we could probably, we've just got the first draft of the paper, and I think that's where we could probably push more. On the payment, so Pakeha is actually, so it's interesting. So I think part of the payment's conditioned. You're supposed to get like a warning, and then you're supposed to get a 10% cut in payment, and then you're supposed to be kicked out of the program if you're still not meeting the conditions. You rarely see it happening, and I think the conditions aren't really that much enforced. And in fact, actually in the paper, I didn't talk about it in the talk, we know whether or not you're currently in Pakeha or whether or not you had ever been on Pakeha. So I'm using whether or not you had ever been on Pakeha here, but we've also tried to analyze the current and the 2-year and the 6-year, and it matches up pretty closely. Once you're in the program, you stay in the program, and the kids stay in the program, and so we don't see a difference in the result. So I think that's not necessarily driving things. Preschool enrollment, that's a good question. I'm not sure. I can check the surveys and take a look more about that. And I like this idea about benchmarking it against, if we just look in the data for like the control group and you see an increase of 7 to, maybe using the trying to think about how we benchmark it to a rise in income. I like that idea. That's something we could do more of. Yeah.
Oh, okay. One more?
Okay. Thank you. It was a really interesting presentation. Just maybe following a little bit on Margaret and some of the other comments on stunting. If I remember correctly from the slide that you showed, there wasn't much impact on what you called malnourishment or wasting, right? But there were significant impacts on stunting. And maybe, did you have any insight on what is the mechanism that allows for no impact to be seen on some of the shorter term measures like wasting, but you do see impacts on stunting? I had a similar outcome in Togo that I was also curious if you had some insight on.
Actually, that was something that I am still confused by and trying to read more and understand a bit more on. So we do see more effects on wasting for boys, and the bigger stunting effects are coming for boys. And so you see a reduction in malnourishment for boys. Sorry, I didn't show those results in the talk. And the stunting effects are both there for boys and girls, but they're much bigger for boys. So it could be that we're able to pick it up.
So can I ask a clarification point? You're saying wasting, but what the slide had was weight for age, which is not wasting.
Underweight. Sorry, I meant underweight. sorry, that I can fix. So you do see some effects for boys, but yeah, sorry, you do see some effects for boys in terms of weight for age. And so it could be that we don't pick it up for the girls because it's not big enough. But I also agree that for me is a puzzle, and I'm just trying to figure out why we see effects on stunting, but not necessarily weight for age. Sorry for the mistake. I can correct that in the slides.
Just a very quick question. I don't know if I missed it, but I presume one of the underlying assumptions is that the untreated group is in itself random, right? But it may be that it's in the most remote areas and the poorest between the, among the poorest. So some of the results may be driven by that, right?
Yeah, no, and I think that's where the randomization helps us, is that it's comparable groups in the treatment and control. And so maybe that's, so I don't think that's necessarily a problem. Yeah.
I have
Oh, great.
Similar question, because some of your explanations for the lack of results seem to be that something is changing in the control group, like they get richer, or
per capita consumption is increasing in the control group.
And this is interesting because also could there be some learning that goes on among the control group when they see that the treatment group is sending their kids to school, and there's a reason why they're sending their kids to school, that there's something that goes on there, which which means that this cumulative effects are going to be somewhat smaller.
So that's an interesting question. I spent a lot of time thinking about that, about whether or not there are spillovers, and also could there be spillovers in the same villages. In Pakeha, it's about 7% treated, so it's really a small percentage of the subdistrict, and the randomization was done across subdistricts and pretty spread out. So you would have to, the mechanism of it leading to a spillover in another subdistrict, I think is likely not what's occurring. I think it's mostly coming from the fact that just Indonesia was growing over this time period. But yeah, no, I've spent a lot of time trying to think about these spillovers, particularly in the 6th year, because you would have thought things could have changed, but I think it's unlikely, is my sense. But, it's hard to rule out these things entirely.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, all right. Just join me in thanking.
Oh, is everybody
yes,
heading off for the
before we go.
game?
Thanks very much.